All right, so welcome back, everyone. We have two very exciting presentations, one from Burak Erkut from BAU Cyprus University on Minsky meets Sraffa, and then for Borja Clavaro on money from the Montfort University on money and hierarchy, 4 ways to discharge a payment obligation. We will hear from each of the speakers for 15 minutes. Burak and Erkut, I'll have a 5-minute warning and a 1-minute warning from you, so to help with the timekeeping. We will then hear each of the speakers comment on each other's presentation, as well as hear from Perry. I'll keep a close eye on the chat, and then I'll ask people to come in with their questions or any commentary that may be taking shape through the chat. All right, so I think we're now ready to begin. Burak, we'll hear first from you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear my voice? Is it all clear? Can you hear me? Okay. So, well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity to present my research for today's session. So, my research is about Minsky meets Sraffa, and the basic question is, of course, how does the emergence of a process innovation take place, and what its implications for money and finance? So in the framework of Sraffa, I'm going to show it. This is a shift from one method of production to the other when profitability declines. In the perspective of Minsky, referring to Schumpeter and finance, this is happening during the phase of managerial capitalism. So this is kind of where we see some convergence. And of course, briefly, I want to talk about the project itself. So my project is about Minsky's Schumpeter and finance approach. So this is a little bit with the particular focus to Austrian and evolutionary school of thought where I'm kind of placed in, and its domain in innovation. So the first paper was presented at EAP September 2020 conference on Minsky meets Porter, the Michael Porter, whom we all know from Introduction to Business lectures. So this was somehow more intuitive approach, and I showed that both scholars, even though they come from different perspectives, they have a similar perspective of money manager capitalism. And there is a route to the Austrian impact, mainly influenced by Schumpeter and his contemporaries who fled from Austria and Germany to USA. Second paper, Minsky meets Sraffa, which is the focus of today, and which is kind of, somehow more difficult to show. Why? Because Sraffa does not focus on finance, and there are certain attempts, such as the one by Pivetti, Franke, or Cicciarone, who try to integrate finance to Sraffian perspective, and some more recent approaches, such as those by Dwoskin and Feldman, they're all partial, and it's, of course, a heroic duty. So starting with Minsky, Perry briefly mentioned his focus on Schumpeter. So Minsky wrote towards the end of his life 2 approaches on Schumpeter and finance, and how we can reconcile a Schumpeterian perspective with Keynesian finance perspective, starting with an evolution of capitalism that starts with commercial capitalism, so production of transportation of goods financed by merchant banks, moving on to finance capitalism, which is mainly industrial consolidation, in which investment banking is used to finance cartels, trusts, and mergers. Managerial capitalism, focusing on corporate growth, in which giant corporations are to be financed by public policies, central banks. And money manager capitalism, which focuses on managed money funds, and which focuses on money managers. And this is kind of a possible collapse is global financial integration. Okay, how about Sraffa? So my focus is on the production of commodities by means of commodities, 1960, even though I'm not from his school of thought, I'm mainly Austrian economist, evolutionary economist. I think it's an interesting book to consider, especially for the history of economic thought. I have it here with me, Turkish translation. So Sraffa basically focused on aiming to offer a criticism to the marginalist approach in economics. And in the tradition of Ricardo, who considers distribution as the primary problem of political economy, and advising to isolate the mechanism of distribution at a particular time in a particular location, as well as the changes associated with these. Okay, so what happens in Sraffa when I talk about innovation and Sraffa? People say, okay, did he really talk anything about that in his framework? Well, he doesn't really refer to a process innovation, but what he says is basically, and that's what we can see in the diagram, a switch in methods of production. So he says that based on the x-axis is the rate of profits and y-axis is the price, it's possible that we have two different methods of production for a certain non-basic commodity.
Burak,
So,
I don't think we can see your presentation.
okay, so I'm not sure how I can do that. Can you see it now?
Yeah, I think we should be good now.
Okay, that's great. So okay, so back to the presentation again. Okay, so Sraffa says there's a switch in the methods of production when we are producing a certain good with, let's say, method 1, and the rate of profit is somehow kind of causing us trouble, then we can switch to another method, which is again focusing on a different rate of profit over time. And he says there may be one or more such interactions. Okay, so regarding process innovations, we are going to come back to that picture, but regarding their epistemological, ontological, and ethic political positions, so I only highlighted some differences in both approaches. In the epistemological case, we know that Minsky's Schumpeter and finance perspective is mainly focusing on propositions, whereas Sraffa is focusing mainly on equations. So there are certain methodological issues there, but they both resemble a strong positivist epistemologically. The ontological position, again, a little bit difference there. So Minsky takes a narrative approach with some historical evidence, verbal analysis. Sraffa is more quantitative in that perspective, and of course he's focusing on some equations. So, but nevertheless, they both aim to discover the relations among different components of the economy. Ethic political positions. So Minsky propagates in favor of regulating financial activities in order to regulate the market activities for a stable economy, and Sraffa focuses on regulating economic activities in order for workers to get the whole national product. Now, when Minsky meets Sraffa, I found one interesting comment of Minsky himself in a session on Schumpeter and Sraffa, effective demand in the long run. So this was 1985 in Florence, and 25th publication anniversary of the famous book by Sraffa. And it's interestingly that Minsky gives a very harsh statement about Sraffa's approach, stating that it cannot explain the late 20th century industrial economy. Okay, there are certain evaluations of his comments. For example, the one by Kurdas, 1989, which the author questions a little bit why Minsky gave such a statement. So the issue is that, of course, when we say Minsky meets Sraffa, there are certain heroic attempts to integrate financial perspective in Sraffa's framework, I'm focusing on a partial perspective, on a specific perspective with respect to innovation. To be more specific, process innovation. So, okay, so process innovation tells us basically that we have a certain new invention with which we can produce a certain good in a more efficient way. And in other words, it's the same good, but produced in a more efficient way with a different technology. So there should be some sort of entrepreneur interested in using this technology, and let's say he switches from method 1 to method 2. So when we interpret Sraffa's approach in this way, what we can see is that, from method 1 to method 2, this can be also by means of introduction of a new method, let's say a process innovation to produce an existing product. So from mainstream industrial organization, we know that a process innovation is kind of a decrease in costs and increase in profitability in the optimal case. And a recent attempt by Dvoskin and Feldman, a working paper on Sraffa Center, aims to integrate this perspective to the Sraffian framework. In other words, how we can integrate process innovation perspective with financial aspect is that the entrepreneur aims to somehow decrease his costs, increase his profitability by this process innovation. At the same time, of course, a process innovation doesn't fall from the sky. So we need some sort of mechanism to finance this. So let's assume this is the case of Sraffa's switch-off method of production with a single point of intersection. This is actually pretty much similar. One can observe in models with the Lotka-Volterra type of equations, most famously survival in the sense of a predator-prey model. What is the logic? So this is the mathematical graphics to the Lotka-Volterra type of equations. It's actually pre-evolutionary, but when we know there is, let's say, a process innovation used by one entrepreneur, all of a sudden his profitability increases, he's producing more efficiently, and the other entrepreneurs active in his sector aim to imitate his approach. How? By using a similar process innovation or maybe the same. And through that way, somehow they are all using the same process innovation or the same technology to produce their goods. It means the one entrepreneur who used to be the only one having this process innovation is not as profitable as before. And so through that way, another process innovation comes and all these predators come to the picture and try to imitate this approach. And through that way, the profits are kind of more evenly distributed among entrepreneurs, not only for one entrepreneur who uses. Okay, so this is pre-evolutionary because Lotka-Volterra type of equations give us a closed system. But what we can see from this picture is that actually pretty much a similar thing is propagated by Minsky with regard to, I'm coming back to the point, with regard to managerial capitalism, where corporate growth needs to be achieved, needs to be financed by means of giant corporations. And one way of corporate growth is, of course, through innovating, because we need to have a certain competitive advantage. But over time, what we see in Minsky's framework is that out of this corporate growth, somehow, once the innovation gains are there, you need to manage these in managed money funds, and the money managers tend to be more conservative when it comes to reinvesting into new R&D, reinvesting into new innovations, and that is kind of a process of decline. Okay, so what we can say is that, well, I mean, it's not a complete work, and when you read certain textbooks, a Sraffa Minsky synthesis is somehow always mentioned, but never finalized. And this is not primarily due to different epistemological or ontological perspectives, but primarily because Sraffa avoids a financial sector explicitly in his model. So I'm not taking this heroic duty as a whole, but I'm taking one specific perspective. A partial perspective, and that is based on one chapter of Sraffa on process innovations, even though it doesn't state that explicitly, to show how the two meet. So one issue that we should integrate by all means, and that's what the stream of research is also showing us, is the financial perspective. Why? Because even though we may have a process innovation, this needs to be financed somehow. So this is clearly failing in Sraffa's approach, but Dworkin and Feldman showed that we can kind of arrange this by means of a Schumpeterian perspective, and if we can do that, the other end is a Minskyan perspective. So this is basically what I wanted to share with you. So I would be glad to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Burak. Borja, you're next, please.
Okay, let me see how this works. Share screen. Let me know if it works. Yes?
Yes.
All right. So let me go real fast because, you know, this is based on a very long paper. It took me a long time to work. All right. So thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Like, I need a lot. All right. So my name is Borja Clavaro. I'm a student in Leicester, UK, in the Montfort University. So basically in this presentation, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a conceptual framework to understand payments. It's based on Perry Mehrling's ideas of T accounts. It's very straightforward, but it's not so simple as it seems, all right? But it's very helpful. And it links directly to Perry's hierarchy of money, and the fact that money is always a liability is the starting point of the framework, all right? So let me start just by pointing out very briefly that we are in the middle of a revolution of payments, you know? This is, everybody knows this. I mean, we have Libra or Diem, cryptos, Alipay, you know, it's lots of innovations in this field. And yet, this is important. We carry a baggage of poor semantic and conceptual tools to deal with these innovations. And this is true even in the legal literature. And this has been recognized in the past. Let me read you two quotes. One says, it is not always clear from the way we talk which party is paying whom. No doubt the confusion arises because concepts appropriate to the simple payment in cash are stretched to make them apply to the more complex world of modern payment mechanisms. David Fox, in his books Property Rights in Money, wrote, "The old paradigm of money as a corporeal shuttle in which ownership passes literally from hand to hand can provide no more than a general analogy to explain the operation of money in the incorporeal context, which is today." So it was very, very clear to me as I was looking to apply Perry's perspective of T accounts to all the payments I could conceive that the vocabulary we have was limited and not very precise. All right, so that's my starting point. So in the remainder of this paper, in the slides, I will survey the literature very briefly to craft a general definition of payment, and I will show it's too narrow. And then I will suggest a new framework which overcomes this and introduce 4 new concepts that there are 4 ways to make payment, all right? And finally, I will just discuss 2 of its applications. All right, first level of approximation. A payment transaction can be described as the performance of an obligation involving 2 legal persons, A and B, A being the payer or debtor, B being the payee, okay, that's basic. A's obligation is obligation to pay, and whether B has any reciprocal obligation will depend on the situation. Sometimes B is simply entitled to receive the benefits or rights that A's obligation confers without compensation, but more frequently, B will have incurred a simultaneous obligation to deliver, all right? So notice already at this level, legal concepts emerge. Then in cases where obligations are reciprocal, there are 2 sides to every transaction. These are called the legs. So there's the delivery leg and there's the cash leg or payment leg, all right? And when we dig deeper, all right, I'm going stage by stage. For a more specific description of what is the act of payment, different terms emerge. At the most abstract level, it can be described as any act offered and accepted in performance of a money obligation. It involves tender and acceptance. At a more concrete level, payment involves transfer, delivery, passage of possession, transmission, to send, to move, to convey, to pass, to hand over, to place at the disposal of. These are all the terms that one encounters in this literature. And the next step is to ask what is being transferred, delivered, passed, etc., etc. And here we encounter different terms as well. We find it referred to as value, monetary amount, monetary claim, or simply money. And in the literature of high-value payment systems, we find settlement assets, funds, and means of payments. All right. So if we take a broad, eclectic approach to defining payment, here's what you get. Payment is said to happen when the payer transfers, delivers, passes possession of, transmits, sends, moves, conveys, hands over, or places settlement assets, funds, money, value, a monetary claim, or means of payment to the payee, and the latter accepts that mode of performance of the obligation. All right, that's the most general definition I could craft. All right, now let me try to apply this to two modes of payment. The first is a household buying a concert ticket, okay, from a ticket seller. These are T accounts. The slides show the two legs of the T accounts, all right? This is typical of what Perry does, and I love this method, it's very clear. So in the first leg, the ticket seller discharges his obligation to deliver the tickets, shown here as a reduction in accounts receivable payable, all right? And the household, in the second leg, the household's turn to discharge its obligation, and it does so by making payment, which is shown here as a transfer of funds from its account to the seller's account. All right, very straightforward. And notice that the verbal description I gave you earlier corresponds to this pretty well. But then consider this second example. Consider the case of a mortgage repayment. Now the payee is a bank, and the funds used to make the payment are the bank's liability, all right? So the accounting mechanics are different. Whereas in the previous example, the payee registered an increase in funds assets. In the current example, the bank, the payee, registers a decrease in funds liabilities. It is the same discharge of the obligation, but the accounting entries are different, very different. So now comes the question, is our official definition of payment useful for this case? No. Nothing is transferred. Transferred denotes funds moving from one place to another, a credit to one account, a debit to another, and so on. And this is how the term is used in the legal scholarship. So on the contrary, in this case, the funds disappear. Notice the blue box. The total amount of funds is smaller after the payment is made, all right? So it makes no sense to talk about a transfer here. So where is this limitation coming from? I mean, this is the legal literature. Why are they so limited? Well, it's baggage. The limitation comes from the fact that money is thought of as gold or an asset with no counterpart liability. But money is always a liability, as Perry will tell you, and money systems are hierarchical, always, as he will tell you as well. So this ends the first part, all right? I set the stage, and I will introduce my framework that can describe all payments and in all their balance sheet incarnations, all right? And this is the framework. It is very, very, very simple. I am amazed that it hasn't been discovered earlier, all right? It is derived from the rules of quadruple entry bookkeeping. It shows the 4 ways of making a payment, that is, of discharging accounts payable liabilities. And I have given them these names: assignment, novation, issuance, and set-off. You can argue whether these terms are appropriate, and I devote a very long appendix in my paper to defend these terms, but I look really hard in the legal literature, and I believe their use is sound and correct. One may also argue what financial instruments enter into category of funds, but there are 4 ways of making a payment is not subject to discussion, all right? Because that would be going against logic. This is logic that determines this. There's no way around it. And the 4 ways of payment can be described as follows. Payment by assignment is a transfer of assets and amounts to a creditor substitution. Payment by novation is the mirror image and is a transfer of liabilities and amounts to a debtor substitution. Payment by issuance issuance increases the claims of the payee on the payer, and payment by set-off or redemption decreases those claims. All right? And this framework fits perfectly into the hierarchy of money. Another framework I really, really love. It's really useful to think about these things. Assignment and novation could be called horizontal payments, and issuance and set-off vertical payments. This is almost like, 1 plus 1 equals 2 is so fundamental. And importantly, while the first two are money neutral, the second two create and destroy money. All right. So this is very strongly linked to banking and money creation. And of course, for reasons of time, I'm not going to explore each of these modes. It takes too long. And I will just instead jump to some of the applications. I will just explain 2 of them, all right? So, but basically this framework gives a fresh perspective on a number of things. For example, a decentralized banking system requires novation to work. Novation, if you didn't get it, it's a liability transfer, okay? Novation gives customer deposits their central status as the main form of money. Set-off also protects banks in the case of borrower insolvency, which may partly explain why loans and deposits have historically been part of the same business, all right? And payment by issuance is what distinguishes banks from non-banks and is behind the money creation process. Also, interbank transfers become much easier to understand. And finally, this framework also helps craft a new definition of money or moneyness, which has long been a tricky subject. But it takes too long, so let me just elaborate on 2 of these. All right. In the case of novation, let's see if I can get this concept across, which is again a liability transfer between banks. It is very easy to see how this is so important in a decentralized banking system. Novation establishes a direct route between the liabilities of different banks, or a way to break the reliance on an intermediate financial instrument, that is cash, by compressing the 2-step process of sale and purchase into a single step. Thus, novation gives the novatable liability, bank deposits, an advantage over other financial instruments, for it can stand on its own, so to speak. So it gives deposits an additional source of liquidity, which I have called novation liquidity. So let's compare, for example, bank deposits and bonds. A bond liability doesn't trade directly for another bond, generally, okay? The holder must sell or redeem the bond for cash and then purchase the new bond. In contrast, a depositor may transfer the deposit from one bank to another without the need to withdraw cash and then redeposit it, all right? This happens behind the scenes, so to speak. So deposits have novation liquidity, bonds do not. Bonds have assignment liquidity or transfer liquidity, which is the traditional definition of liquidity, but they don't have novation liquidity. Novation can also be used to explain why banks create money. For example, when you get a mortgage and you get credited your account with the bank, you are accepting a liability in payment and you are incurring credit risk. So you may say that the possibility of transferring that liability or novation to another issuer gives you some kind of protection. If you suspect the bank is not solvent, you may transfer the funds to another bank, which it can honor its liabilities with more safety. All right. And novation also provides a fresh look of looking at banking and currency unions, which can be conceived as one big machine for making novation possible. What is a banking union? It is a legal construct that attempts to make the system work as one big bank by making the liabilities of different legal entities equivalent, which intrinsically they are not, just a fiction. Okay? And we could go even further and restate the phrase by John Commons in his famous book, The Legal Foundations of Capitalism, who wrote, "Modern capitalism begins with the assignment and negotiability of contracts." And we may say that modern banking, understood as a system with many banks that offer deposits, begins with the assignment and novation of those deposits. Finally, if I'm not running out of time, I would like to discuss the way this framework helps to clarify cross-border payments, especially interbank settlements, which are really confusing sometimes. In the legal literature, one finds the term transfer used very loosely to refer to debits and credits to accounts, but are those accounts assets or liabilities? Rarely one finds this discussed. So the structure they suggest implicitly is a flat structure and ignores the hierarchy of nature, the hierarchical nature of money, all right? And that's a really big mistake, all right? So take the following example, which is not atypical of how a cross-border payment works. A Swiss, let me see if you can follow this. A Swiss exporter sells goods to a US importer. In order to settle the payment, 5 banks are involved. That's a lot of banks, all right? But this is a typical example. Since the exporter holds its account with a Swiss savings bank, the savings bank uses the corresponding services of UBS to settle the payment. UBS uses its New York office to settle with the importer's bank, Bank of America. And both UBS New York and Bank of America settle on the books of the Fed. So I'm going to run through each of these payments to see how many of them can be described as a transfer, which is the default word that people use, and you will be surprised. Let's start with reserves. The Fed debits the Bank of America's reserve account and credits UBS New York's reserve account, all right? Very simple. But what looks like a simple transaction actually involves 3 payment legs. Payment by Bank of America by set-off to the Fed, payment by assignment or transfer by Bank of America to UBS New York, and payment by issuance by the Fed to UBS New York. 3 payments. You may wonder, how can there be 3 payments if only one financial instrument is involved, namely reserves? The answer is that as long as there are 3 entities have settled with each other, the transaction is not complete. For example, if Bank of America discharges its obligation to UBS New York, and if the Fed fails to execute the debits and credits, it is the Fed's fault as an agent of both banks. And if the Fed's obligation to carry out the debiting and crediting, if it doesn't, well, too bad. But Bank of America is considered discharged, all right? Therefore, this simple transaction involves 3 payments, 3 discharges of payment obligation. And I'm sorry, I know this is very arid, but it is the way it is, all right? Let me just finish with this. All right, so I've gone through the literature and this is recognized, all right? This is different. The literature sometimes thinks of this as one transaction, but there are many different transactions going on. And we should be able to distinguish them with names, which is what I do. All right, so let's see the corresponding banking payment. UBS Switzerland headquarters gets credited its Nostro account with UBS New York, which may be a branch or a subsidiary. And then UBS Switzerland credits the savings bank's Vostro account. Again, what looks as a single transaction are actually 2 payments by issuance. Finally, let's see the deposit flow, the customer deposit flow. The importer transfers or assigns funds in its deposit account to the exporter. For that to happen, Bank of America novates that deposit liability, or transfers it, in quotation marks, to the savings bank. What seems like a single transaction again involves 4 payment legs: assignment, novation, issuance, and set-off. 4, not just 1, right? And if we add up all these payments, we have 9 payments, 22% of which are transfers. Just 22, all right? There are twice as many issuances. Yeah, I'm out of time?
Yes.
All right, I'm concluding.
Great,
this is the last slide. So to summarize, this is, I'm pretty sure this is quite boring. I haven't since shown any graph or anything. It's very conceptual, but this is, I believe this is a very useful framework, all right? There's 4 ways of making a payment, not just one. It's not just transfers, okay? There's 4 ways, the 4 words I gave you. And one may argue about the names, all right? We can check the appendix, it's very long. It took me a lot of time. But that there are 4 ways to make a payment, that cannot be argued, all right? That's logic. It's quadruple entry bookkeeping, okay? Finally, I leave you with a quote on the importance of concepts in science, all right? Our understanding of the world is achieved more effectively by conceptual improvements than by the discovery of new facts, even though they are not mutually exclusive. Those are not far wrong who insist that the progress of science consists principally in the progress of scientific concepts. And I really believe this is true. So that's it. Thank you very much.
All right. Borja, thank you so much for that presentation. I wanted to offer both you and Burak the opportunity to comment on each other's presentations.
All right, Burak, if you want to start, because I might out of breath.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Larissa, and thank you very much, Borja, for this interesting presentation. In fact, this is not, I mean, you said this is boring stuff, but I don't believe that this is boring stuff. On the contrary, you are introducing a novelty to the literature on a very fundamental level. I mean, I didn't read the paper, I would be glad to read, but one thing that appeared to me when going through the slides was a paper or a book by Stefano Ugolini on the history of central banking, about which I also wrote a book critique to Journal of Evolutionary Economics just a few months ago. So, I mean, what you are showing here is basically based on T accounts. So what he is arguing in terms of payment systems is a more verbal way, but my advice, or rather a friendly comment, would be if you can link your T accounts to his historical and theoretical arguments, I think there you can make your framework more stronger, because especially, I mean, we don't see this kind of fundamental overview, but what we can see from the literature, as far as I am familiar with, is a lot of historical evidence on actually each four of these cases that you are referring to. So this would be my advice, and I think it's very interesting, and would be also glad to read the full paper at an occasion. So these would be my comments.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I know Golini's book. I actually cited, I think. He has nice comments on innovation, actually. And yeah, so thanks for the reference. And regarding, you know, your paper, I'm afraid I cannot really comment. I am not familiar really with Sraffa. I'm familiar with Porter, the fact, you know, Competitive Advantage of Nations. That's the first book I read in economics. But I have shifted so, you know, such a different path now that I cannot comment really. I couldn't.
That's not a problem.
Useful feedback.
That's not a problem. Thank you.
So if anyone has any question or wants to give some feedback, they are welcome.
Well, I think everybody in the chat wants a copy of your slides and your paper.
I don't believe that. Let me check. Well, the paper is not. I will finish it, so I will share it. All right. Yeah.
Yes,
sure.
there have been repeated requests.
All right.
I think I was on mute before. Perry, would you want to make a comment before we move to questions?
Sure. Let me share my screen. If you can stop sharing your screen so I can get on there.
Borja, I think you need to stop sharing your screen.
You need to
Oh,
stop
sorry.
sharing.
No? Okay.
What I just want to point out is that this four thing idea, okay, is in lecture 5, okay, of the MOOC, right there, and it is where you're thinking all the four ways you're thinking about making a payment. It's quite correct that they're logical ways. I'm thinking of this in one big bank, however, and the contribution you're making is the legal infrastructure in a decentralized banking system. Makes this thing a lot more complicated. And so, here you can see in Bank B, you could have gamma paying alpha, and that causes an expansion of the balance sheet. You could have alpha paying beta. You could have gamma paying lambda. So all four possibilities are there. And I am I'm not sure. In the very next page of that lecture, it shows that what happens to the balance sheets. Let me stop that. The point is not at all to diminish your contribution, which is enormous, because the legal literature here is very complicated. Joseph Summers is the person who I paid attention to about that, but I really don't know this legal stuff, and it's a very interesting thing, the way lawyers have to confront the reality of the payment system, and they have to find procedures for dealing with this reality and regularizing it and making it possible for people to sue each other, saying, you say you paid me, but you didn't pay me. Okay, so there has to be some process about that. I would maybe draw your attention also. I learned a lot of this from Hick's Market Theory of Money book, 1989, where the two legs aspect, emphasizing that basically there's always a credit piece here, okay, and then there's a settlement of the credit piece. And so that many payments are really promises to pay, okay, and so they're settled at different times. But I think really fleshing out the legal side of this, I really appreciate that. This is a great contribution. And so I'm just linking it. You may not have realized that was in lecture 5, but the point is that it makes it stronger. That there are these four logical possibilities. That's right.
Yeah,
it's good to put names on them. I didn't do that.
Yeah, and I'm very familiar with the MOOC, and I remember this slide and especially correspondent banking, which makes this especially evident. These possibilities of, do you debit my account? Do I credit yours? This kind of thing. Yeah, it's we need names for this. I was doing research. We don't have names to call these things. Yeah. We should have names.
So there are a number of comments on the chat. Oh, I think there was one question for Burak, and I don't know if he's still on, given he shut his video. And also a number of comments. Oh, Burak. Karen had a question for you. And then we can move on to Borja, the number of comments from Borja's paper.
Yeah, I have seen the question. I think it was why Minsky needs Sraffa. So thank you for the question. I think it's, I was thinking the other way around. So maybe Minsky doesn't need Sraffa because the theory of Schumpeterian finance, the concept of Schumpeterian finance and the evolution of capitalism is self-contained. But Sraffa would need Minsky because Sraffa's framework, basically, for starting with a substantial economy and moving all the way to no-name process innovation, doesn't include any aspect of finance. So I believe, and that's what the history of economic thought is also showing us, that in certain perspectives, Minsky and Sraffa would not fall far away from each other. So one way to achieve the financial dimension of innovations in Sraffian framework would go through the framework of Minsky on the evolution of capitalism. I'm not sure if this answers the question.
All right, we'll move on to people who have raised their hands. Chris, Dan, then Anush.
Hi, yeah, so I was going to just make a little comment, or I suppose part of the question about the transfer, the payment between Bank 1 and Bank 2 via the Fed. So we had, was it UBS and I can't remember the other one.
Yeah.
and you describe that as 3 payments, and I wonder whether it might be better to think of it as 2 payments being the equivalent of a single payment. So the payment from Bank 1 to the Fed is 1 payment. There's a payment from the Fed to Bank 2, and the net effect of that is for it to be a payment from Bank 1 to Bank 2. So if we, and the other thing I was going to say was, if you think of all of one feature which all of the types of payments have, is it's a transfer of one person's net worth to another person.
Regarding the second issue, no. The net worth may be unchanged. I mean, you may trade financial instruments and your net worth is unchanged. I think Perry would agree with this. It's not always goods and services that you trade, you know. And regarding the
transfer, if you write off somebody else's debt, then that's a transfer of some of their.
Yeah, but that's the second leg of the transaction. If the first leg of the transaction, which is maybe a trade in securities, you know, then the net worth of the 2 people is still the same. You know, if they trade goods or something else, yeah, then the net worth changes. Depends on what happens in the first leg or the non-payment leg. You know.
Sorry, can I just come back to that, because I'm thinking about the 2 halves of the transaction separately. So if you think about the 2 individual legs, each leg, so one leg might be a payment. So you're transferring. You know, when UBS writes off a debt owed by the Fed, then that's a payment from UBS to the Fed, and then the Fed uses novation, is it, to create a new debt owed to the whichever New York bank it was.
That's right.
Itself is another transfer of net worth from the Fed to the New York bank, and then the overall effect of that was to make a transfer of net worth from UBS to the New York bank, ignoring all the other leg of these transactions. I know, just something to think about. I'd love to talk to you about it a bit more, actually, if we.
Sure, we can talk. But let me point out, you mentioned, what was the first issue you raised?
The idea that that the payment from the Bank 1 to the Fed and the payment from the Fed to Bank 2.
You say there's just 2 payments. There's
resolve
no 3.
Your payment from Bank 1 to Bank 2.
Yeah, that's what it seems, and that's a very good point. It seems that it's just reserve, credit and debit. How can there be 3 payments? But if you really go down deeply and you break down into this little step-by-step process, there's 3 actually. There's 3 transactions. You can decompose. I call it the leg-by-leg dissection. You go leg by leg and you can see 3, because there's 3 entities and they have to settle with each other. So there's 3 actual payments, you may say. Yeah. It's not very intuitive.
Is there a way I can contact you to talk about this a bit more?
The what? The what, sorry, please?
Sorry, is there a way I can contact you to talk about this a bit more?
Sure, I will share my email now. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
All right. Dan, I think you had your hands up next.
Thanks. Thanks, Borja. I have a couple of quick questions, but they might be more comments because they might be too large for you to resolve now. But I'm very interested in this work. I had done some thinking along these lines myself, but never quite got it to the point that you have got it to. So I appreciate your interventions here. I've shared in the chat a couple of papers for everyone, but you in particular, Borja, since you're working on this, you might find it most interesting coming from a mathematical perspective, but getting fairly close to where you are. And so perhaps some interest or inspiration for you. I worked on them and was never quite able to make too much of it. So perhaps you will. A couple of observations. One, you had a slide early on reflecting balance sheet transactions for the sale of concert tickets. And it raises an interesting point, which is that, in practice, you wrote it all down in as monetary quantities denominated in euros, but the actual thing that's being transferred there is property rights associated with the concert ticket itself on one side of the transaction, not money. So this is something that we encounter a lot, I think, and it's a pretty basic accounting problem. So maybe the thing that needs to be made more explicit is the role of prices there. Not that it matters so much with concert tickets, but with traded assets, where a price is what converts between a financial asset and the value at which it gets carried on somebody's books. You know, some more explicit acknowledgement of the price as a variable that can change, and in certain contexts changes in a very very relevant way at a very relevant moment. That could be a useful addition. Somewhat more abstractly, I wonder if you have given thought or what, let's say, what it would look like if you expressed your taxonomy, with which I certainly agree, for means of discharging a payment. I wonder what it would look like if you expressed it not in terms of assets and liabilities, but in terms of debits and credits. So you get 4 because you have 2 columns, assets and liabilities, and the sign can be positive or negative. So I think you could get the same thing looking at it with only positive numbers, but thinking about how the payments are arranged in terms of debits and credits. I say this because I think, you know, whether something is an asset or a liability involves somewhat more interpretation than whether it's a debit or credit. For example, someone who borrows money but doesn't intend to pay it back, but you know, the bank's not aware of that, then the bank is treating it as an asset while the borrower has treated it as income, and it's only later that the difference between those 2 interpretations gets revealed. Whereas if you thought of it in terms of debits and credits, then the 2 parties would be forced to interpret it in the same way. So let me leave it there, but thank you again for your contributions, and I am quite interested in this. If perhaps there'll be an opportunity for us to continue the conversation.
Sure. I think, Dan, you're raising the question, you are distinguishing between, there's 2 kinds of accounting as far as I know. There's cash flow accounting and accrual accounting. I guess I'm using cash flow accounting. I mean, there's no issues of, you know, this is debt instruments. It's easy to value them. There's not issues of, you know, valuation or revaluation. So these are just flows and transactions, and there's no change in value. There's no exchange rates. I don't know what else to say.
Okay, great. Next, I think Anush had his hand raised, and then Karen, and then I think we had a question from Ilham.
Yeah, thank you. My question has to do with the fact that this is a Swiss exporter you're talking about, but you assume everything is in dollars. But the Swiss exporter may eventually want to have Swiss francs. So in what way would that change the way of setting this whole thing up? Because then you have to go into the central bank reserves that affect reserves at one point, as far as I can see.
Yeah, Karen, you are digging into you are following the money, basically, which is what I love to do, and I think what Perry likes to do also. Where does the money end? How is it used? When does it get exchanged for, you know, Swiss franc and so on? You know, that doesn't change a thing on my framework. Doesn't make any difference. I mean, it is an interesting subject, and in fact, I'm working on a paper on, you know, correspondent banking, which is a very gray area. There's not a lot of written about it, but it doesn't change a thing. I don't think. You know, there may be issues of exchange rate revaluation, but doesn't change really the framework, I don't think.
Anush?
No, I agree with you. Well, it does in a way, because there's a certain doubling going on, as far as I know, in that case, but and some reserves going down. But another question is, I mean, all of this is equivalent. There's no fees paid. There's no interest rate, and so on and so forth. So why why would there be 9 banks or 4 banks, or is there any tendency in this? I mean, you're sort of about just making a point of how these things would be recorded, as far as I'm concerned. But how would you develop it into something that has to do with the way things really work, where there is cuts and all of these things?
Well,
and what's the interest in having more or less change in this movement?
I mean, what it helps, the framework helps in clarifying. That's it. I mean, it's a tool. Then you have to use it to, the subject itself is very interesting. I agree, and I love it. I love cross-border payments, and there's very little written about this. But the framework itself doesn't lead you there. It's a tool. You have to use it and dig the literature, and it helps you clarify your mind and what's going on, and all the. You keep in mind, this framework tells you there's, for example, 2 banks. This is what Perry talks about. 2 banks could pay each other in 4 different ways, because they can issue liabilities and they can hold funds assets. So there's 4 logical ways 2 banks could pay each other. And when you multiply this by 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 correspondent banks, it's combinatorial. There's huge possibilities. And the framework helps you keep in mind these possibilities, and you shouldn't be surprised if some banks pay each other by issuing a liability, others by, transferring an asset, or these kind of combinations. So it helps that. It's a tool. It doesn't tell you anything. You have to use it.
Okay, Anush.
No, thanks. I think it's more than naming what you've done, Borja. I think it's clarifying this conceptual point. Wolf kind of makes the point in the chat as well. And I pasted in a Commons quote. I instantly thought of Commons when you were giving your paper. Because I think the big ticket conceptual point is that a money economy is different from a Sraffa economy.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not different in the detail. And I think this also goes back to Minsky, because the one school of thought that we didn't mention, we mentioned Oscar Lange, we mentioned Simons. Am I audible? Is of course the American institutionalists, and Commons is absolutely central here, right? And the reason why you get away from why your vocabulary is important is that you're getting away from a physicalist concept of transfer.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is super, 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 super important, because that is the inheritance of classical economics, right? And I'll just to not to be pedantic, but to read out the Commons discovers this at the cellular level, as it were, of the economy, which is the transaction, right? So the development of Hicks is sort of coming at this from another point, but the point about Commons is he sees that every leg is a contract. Every leg it's not so what he says transactions, the cellular level, are not emphatically not the exchange of commodities, but the alienation acquisition between individuals of rights of property. What we are doing is negotiating rights between each other. There is an irreducible legal layer between things. The world of the classical economists is the merest fiction. So it's not that the payment system is a detail, it is the medium. The rights stand between us and the property. There is no, it is only a regime of property that gives us the control of commodities. In other words, you're soaked in this institutional world. That is the world, not the world of the classical economists, right? And these rights are assigned by society, have to be monitored by society, have to be constantly negotiated. So that brings in Dan's point about prices. And so this is the key issue, quite apart from the detailing of this Baroque and combinatorial framework. I mean, that's absolutely important. But before we get too far down that rabbit hole, I want us to not miss this point, that it emphasizes that this physicalist world, the notion of a deposit, we're taking something and putting it in a building. That's emphatically not what happens, right? We're negotiating rights. And to get us from the world of transfers to the world of rights, credit as a set of relationships, I think that is the real power of this, of using this language. The concepts get us out of that world and into the real world. So I just wanted to make sure we sort of didn't get, that we didn't miss the opportunity to drive that point home. But thank you for that.
I agree with you, but for different reasons. I didn't go to law. I don't know anything about law. I just read a lot of it in 10 months. That's it. And I think the paper is correct and so, but I'm just an amateur. But I didn't go to the law literature because I like it or anything. It wasn't a default option. It's because, it's because of Perry's point, or the way I put it. Money is always a liability, and a liability is a contract. And it's usually a debt contract, very usually. And that's law. So you cannot escape it. It's right there. And that's the fundamental that you said. Neoclassical economics, resembles a lot of this world of money as gold. And many people have this in their minds. And I remember when I was learning about economics and banking, I realized money is a liability. My God. It was so,
apparently it's not just people that have it in their minds, but it's the
economists
lawyers
too.
that have it in their minds also.
Yeah,
That is the
it's
issue.
pervasive because it's intuitive and it seems right and it seems fair. And Perry talks about this.
Exactly.
And in fact, Perry always says this is the main problem in overcoming this, bias. I mean, bias. It's difficult to understand because you have to realize money is a liability. And I remember when I realized this, I was amazed. It was like an epiphany. It's such a stupid thing. It's so simple, but it's so beautiful and elegant and ingenious. It's so ingenious. And when you realize this, all the things you hear are very suspect, all the language we use. And then I said, okay, maybe the legal literature has it right. And no, it doesn't. It talks about transfers and it's very vague and dispersed. So I said, we need names. Maybe the names I offered are wrong, but that we need 4 names, at least 4 new names, I think to me is inescapable. So, and I agree with you, this you should, forget about this world of gold and money as gold. Money is not like that. 200 years ago it was maybe, but now, and cross-border payments, we should understand
It's not just money. It's not just that money is not like that. It's that economic life is not like that. That's the point about. That's why commons starts with the transaction, right?
Yeah.
It's that the transaction happens in time, and the thing that links time A to time B is the contract, is the debt contract. So payments. That's why the credit system, the payment system, is a credit system. And this is of course Hicks's point that most payments are not spot payments. So what is then tying the different legs of the transaction together? Contract. And that's in the most basic everyday daily operation, right? So it's not a point about money. In fact, one can use the point about money to make a general point about the ontology of the economy.
Yeah, in fact,
that is the point. That is Minsky's point about capitalism being a financial system.
Yeah, that's right. In fact, in my
ontology of this entity.
You are right. In fact, in my appendix, I don't call it the payments framework. I call it the settlements framework. I know I expand it to any kind of transaction, with 2 legs. And then the payments framework is just that, but in a specific case when money is involved. You could have barter, but it's still a contract. There's still 2 legs to a transaction. Even a gift has 2 legs to a transaction. All right, and it's a contract. It can be described as a contract and as a debt and so on. This is very clear in the literature, by the way. So yeah, I mean, my style of research is fundamental. I don't like being wrong. I like being, I'm very tangible. I like detail, as you say, cellular. I think you use the name. And then, I like looking at these things, the fundamental stuff of trade and so on. So.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of agreement in the chat to the comments being made by Nush and Borja. So I don't want to lose track. Elham had a question. Do you want to come in? And then Mehdi, I saw that you have raised your hand, I think. Elham? All right, maybe Mehdi, we'll go to you first.
All right, do you hear me? Everybody hears me?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm Mehdi Shoghi from the University of Bergamo in Italy, which I did research on Sraffa archive in Trinity with Scott Carter from the University of Missouri. Well, just a couple of comments on both papers. There are comments, maybe there will be questions as well. You know, Sraffa shouldn't be reduced to the production of commodities by means of commodities, first of all, because he has extensive research on finance. So he has a history of finance, which has been taught in Cambridge in between 1931, a course that is brilliant, still readable, very, and it's available online. If you go on the Sraffa archives in Trinity College, you can actually access this. And then there's the criticism on Hayek's prices and production, which is written about extensively. So that is also a great source of monetary thought. He understood monetary systems. His dissertation in Italy was about the crisis in Italian banking system. So he was a great scholar of banking, and actually the concept of money as a contract is cited by Sraffa in his criticism of Hayek, money as a relation as well. So Sraffa, that book, that the production of commodities by means of commodities, has to be treated as a logical exercise only. So now with the access to the Sraffa's papers, we have a more comprehensive view of Sraffa's points of view about money, about Marxian value theory, and so on and so forth. So maybe that point of view, because money is not there in the production of commodities, but in Sraffa, money is always very much there. And this has been a fault of various reasons, because Sraffa hasn't been studied in his papers, and the books that were out weren't about money. So now there is a renewal and a revival of the Sraffa studies that it's very much worth looking into. So anyway, about Dan's book, I unfortunately didn't have the opportunity to read the book. Unfortunately, here in University of Bergamo, Minsky is very important, also because you cited the book with Ferri. Ferri is from University of Bergamo, and he lived in Bergamo. He has still a house in Bergamo. Minsky's wife comes to Bergamo now and then. And I did some research on Minsky, archival research, especially about the book of 1981, which, if I don't make a mistake, he didn't cite. It was Can It Happen Again, which is a collection of papers about the financial crisis, in which at the end he arrives at the conclusion that with the great intervention and the size of the government and the safe assets around, a crisis is less probable. But that is what actually happens then. So if you want to go back to the 2007, 2008 crisis and look at it with Minsky and eyes, then there is a comment Minsky made on a paper in '82 by Sweezy. Sweezy and another author, I don't remember, which was about private debt. And Minsky had a sort of pre-Godlian, Wayne Godlian sort of sectoral balances way of looking at things. So for him, of course, the debt could be both on the sides of the firms and this household. And he didn't reject the possibility of a household debt. And his comment on Sweezy's paper, which is actually about private debt, does show that he was well aware of the increasing weight of the private debt. All right, that's all for me. Thank you.
All right, well, we would love to hear comments. I think we're about at time, and I know we could just keep the discussion going, so maybe we save a bit for the liquidity happy hour. So I'll pass it over to Jay for next steps.
Yeah, thank you very much for a great session. I just want to quickly outline how we're going to treat the rest of the program, since we're a little bit out of whack with the schedule at the moment. But I would like to just, instead of going into break right now, use the next 10 or so minutes to discuss the projects, go into a break, and then start with Perry's presentation, if that's all right with you. And so we would right now basically go until the top of the hour to talk about the projects that are happening, if that's all right with you. Is everybody here who's got something to share? I have primarily on my list Alex, Jeremy, perhaps Larissa, and myself, but and I think others who have been working, I think Natalie in particular, can also comment quickly. But what I would like to do is just briefly outline this, and we will sort of follow up by the beginning of next week, a detailed list of projects and how you can follow up with them, so you don't have to listen in detail to the presentation, but just to give a sense of the ideas that have been floating around. So let me just list the 4 ideas again that we sent around. The 4 developed ideas are that we're retaking the course at some point this year. The second project that has been developed is on the fourth price of money, inflation discussion group. We have a reading group, and we have a post-mortem on the chat from last time. So let me start with Alex on the first 2 items.
Yeah, so retaking the MOOC, we're going to start on May 17th. That date is chosen pretty arbitrarily. No one had a strong preference, but if we start then, my wife can join us. So that's when I'm starting. I will share a Google spreadsheet where you can sign up if you want to do it. We're going to be doing it through Reddit. So I did this last summer on the r/CMT Economics subreddit, but this time I figured why not have a Money View subreddit, because there's no Money View subreddit. So I created a Money View subreddit, and I'll just put that in the chat, our Money View. And essentially the way it'll work is that we'll do the lectures, 2 lectures a week, 1 reading a week, just like the actual course. And we'll have a master Reddit post that'll link to a thread for discussing each of the lectures and readings. And each one will go live kind of in real time as the course goes forward. We're all going to do it at the same time. Obviously, you can take the course whenever you want, but it's exciting to go through it with people. And that subreddit, I just created it today, and we can do whatever we want with it. If someone else is really into Reddit and wants to kind of manage that or something, that's fine. I'm mainly going to use it for going through the course this time, but feel free to share anything related to Money View in the subreddit. We will also meet via video chat. So we'll watch the lectures on our own, do the readings on our own, comment in the Reddit, and then we will meet via video chat once or twice a week. And if you sign up and you want to be a part of this, we can all kind of come up with times that work well for us. Let me link, I should link you to the Google Sheet now. Hold on. There it is. So that's the Google Sheet in the chat. Oh, and also, as of today, I'm really excited to incorporate Borja's nomenclature, because a lot of times in the lectures, Perry Mehrling is like, I've shown it happening through a transfer of assets, but we could also create a liability. There's multiple ways to do it. And then, obviously in those lecture notes, he has like the different ways of doing things. Having names for those is going to make it a lot easier to talk about. So I really appreciate that, Borja. And we also want to incorporate maybe some of Perry Mehrling's more recent video lectures that he's done and papers that he's written. So it'll, it's for people who've gone through it before. So so we're adding more. And so that's that. And then I can get on to the fourth price of money group, which Natalie will also maybe have some comments on. But basically, we have this group together. The way we're setting it up is that we're going to have a standing weekly video meeting, and then every other week, the plan is to invite a speaker to speak about a particular reading. So we'll do the reading, talk about it, then invite the speaker the following week. So it'll alternate weeks. So that's the plan for that one. I'm really interested in the fourth price of money, the price level. We call it the fourth price of money because it's the one that does not get emphasized as much in the MOOC and by Perry Mehrling in the Money View. And we want to kind of connect it up to the rest of the Money View. And I'm personally, some people are interested in exploring inflation and deflation. I'm personally interested in exploring a stable price level, and what that means, what constraints that places on money, and how it connects up with the real economy. So I like to say that money is a promise to pay goods, and Perry is going to give his talk a little bit later about payments versus funding and reflux for today, the law of reflux for today. And when we think about the law of reflux, it's normally there's this survival constraint that banks have to meet. They have to have the thing that you're trying to redeem the money for. So that's why they decide to reflux money back into themselves, right? So what is providing that constraint for the government? And I would argue that the price level is a key part of that. So we're going to get into a lot of price level stuff in that group, and I will share a link for a spreadsheet for you to sign up for that as well. And Natalie, maybe you want to add some comments?
Yeah, no, I think you explained pretty well what the group is about. So I think that's it. The idea is to have this discussion among ourselves, but also invite speakers so we can have a broader conversation about it. And of course, explore all the theories that we can possibly get. So that's the main idea.
Yeah, this should be really exciting. Thank you. I would like to invite Jeremy to come on and talk about the post-mortem of the chat log from the last time we met.
Yes, thank you, Jay. Interrupt me if you can hear me. And thank you for the opportunity to share some of my ideas on the chat log. First of all, I have to say that it's until yesterday that I've seen Larissa's summary on the videos. It's really intensive and detailed, and it's really great. So compared to my work, it's quite simple. So I've noticed that there's resources, papers, and some exchange of ideas that have in the chat log. So I've kind of going through them and exert some of the things, in my opinion, that are interesting and worthwhile to share with everyone. So I kind of group some of the exchange by pieces and put some like names on the pieces. So afterwards, maybe we can just, it's kind of facilitating the going through of the chat log. Instead of looking at the raw chat log, you can look some keywords and quickly identify the part you're interested in. Or when, I think after that, I think it's better using that resources alongside probably with the documents of Larissa. So that in that kind, one side is the chat and one side is the presentation. So in that way, maybe it's better to capture and review some of idea that appears during our conference or exchange. So in this, but just at one point last time, because I am not aware of the logging of the chat, I'm using the mobile app, so I don't have the PDF. This time I open my PC on it, so theoretically I should have all the conversation. And this time I think it will be more complete than last time. So I think that's all.
Well, Jeremy, do you want to quickly share it here in the chat, because it's quite impressive and it's really great what you've done?
Sorry, I don't have actual link. Maybe you can find your email.
I'll do it in a second, but you should be, yeah, like I said, I'll be sending out an email to all participants with the summary of all the follow-up
Yeah,
projects.
maybe
So
I think it's better to add a table of contents, something like that. It's not completely finished, but it should be at more or less as it is.
Yeah, it's great. I'll do that in a second. I'll pull it up in a second. The final thing that I would like to mention is the thing that you already know about, the reading group. The way I'm approaching it is that we will meet every other week, maybe on a Thursday. I think the first day I have in mind is March 18th. I believe that's a Thursday. And then we meet every other week. There are 2 books that are on the agenda right now that have been mentioned to read. Of course, Dan's book, Minsky. There will be 2 sessions initially. I think there's a chance we'll have a 3rd session if there's more interest. We can meet if there's more demand or more debate, or Dan, we, for example, want to focus specifically on one of the issues as they were raised today. I think there's scope to have additional meetings, but the idea is that we would read, for instance, the first 4 chapters of the book, and then finish the last 4 chapters of the book in the second reading. So that's just a chance for you to actually do the reading and check in with people to discuss what you've observed. I think we might want to then also schedule additional meetings if there's specific debates, or if we want to bring in the various authors of the books. So that would basically mean we focus on Dan's book for March, and we would then move into Perry's book, New Lombard Street, for April. And those are books that are pretty straightforward, but just to get us on the same page, they're very core Money View books. And there's a number of other books that have been raised by all of you in the chat and over the discussions that we'll just decide which one of those books we go with next. But just to give you a sense of the list of books that we currently have on our list here: The Art of Central Banking by Ralph Hawtrey, The World in Depression by Charles Kindleberger, Controlling Credit by Eric Monet, Money, Interest, and Public Interest by Perry Mehrling, Fisher Black by Perry Mehrling, Wheels of Commerce by Fernand Braudel, and then other things like The Great Demographic Reversal by Charles Kindleberger, and so forth. So these are currently books that we're interested in looking at, and that's basically the agenda. And if you're interested in this and you'd like to sort of take ownership over reading some of the chapters and discussing some of the chapters, I think that would be really great to get in touch. But I'll give you exact details of how that might work in the follow-up email. So just mark that on your calendar. Now that's basically the projects that have already been decided that are ongoing. Some ideas have not materialized into concrete projects. Primarily, there's been a discussion of looking at currency internationalization, primarily renminbi and euro internationalization as a possible topic to explore, and also further discussions on global South finance, in particular engaging primarily with the structuralist school. The structuralist school is interesting because we're in touch with the institution that is actually still heralding this approach. The Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean in Santiago de Chile just has completed a summer school, and there's a whole cohort of students that would like to read Celso Furtado, Raul Prebisch, and so forth, and maybe we can look at some of these issues together. So again, you'll get a summary of all these issues in your email soon. We'll summarize all them and get them packaged for you. But that's just a quick overview of what has been in the works.
But one more thing in the works. So I am still working on the data visualization. I was hoping to get like a fancy version prototype, but it's still a couple of weeks away. But I'm actually happy because Borja's classification gives me new ideas of like how to do the interactivity in the visual presentation. So more news on that forthcoming.